The Switch era of Pokemon can't really be described in words, but it can be described in a sound. That sound being, huh. For every positive you can name for this generation of Pokemon, there's probably a negative closely following it. Maybe it's a result of a more vocal internet, but it feels more criticism has found its way to the Pokemon Company than ever before. But is it justified? Join me as we look back at every game released during the Switch era of Pokemon. For the sake of time, we'll be excluding spin-offs like Mystery Dungeon or Pokken. First things first, we had the nostalgia trip that was Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. In my mind, this game had three main objectives: capitalise on Pokemon Go by converting mobile players to console and convincing console players to try mobile. Secondly would be to lean into nostalgia of the older crowd like myself by giving us a HD look at our childhood game. And finally, to make an easily accessible game for very young children to get them hooked on Pokemon. Let's be honest, regardless of what you thought about these games, it did succeed in all three missions. The Pokemon Go-esque catcher mechanic amongst other crossovers was something directly relatable for that crowd. Furthermore, the direct integration with Pokemon Go not only encouraged, but also incentivized players to try both games, Meltan being one of the main factors here. Essentially, here's a brand new mythical Pokemon, and the only way you can get your hands on it legitimately is to download Pokemon Go, own a copy of Let's Go, and connect them. Transferring a Pokemon from Go to Let's Go would activate a box in Go that spawns Meltan, but if you wanted its evolution, Melmetal, you would need to catch a decent amount of them. And with there being a cooldown period on this box, you would need to play Go over the span of a couple weeks. I don't know the conversion rate of how many people continue playing Go after they got their Melmetals, but I would wager it was a worthwhile amount. Looking at the game as a whole, while it very much so strayed away from the traditional mechanics, most Pokemon fans were happy enough to explore their childhood games in full HD. The most recent way we could experience Kanto prior to these games was in Heart Gold Soul Silver, after beating the Elite Four and unlocking the region as a post-game type of situation. And before that, of course, was Fire Red and Leaf Green. Going from this to this was amazing to see. For the first time in franchise history, we also got something Pokemon fans had been wishing for since the game's inception: Pokemon spawning in the overworld. A simple change like this truly brings the world to life and would end up being the start of what is now commonplace in the games. Conversely, fans weren't happy at how dumbed down things were, no challenge existed, and one of the game's major pulls, battling, wasn't really a thing. Not in a competitive sense, should I say. These factors meant Let's Go essentially turned into a shiny hunt simulator once you beat the core game and completed your decks. For me, the games were fun enough, and even today I go back from time to time to do some shiny hunting, including this Mewtwo I got a couple weeks ago. Personally speaking, I actually kind of wish they continued to do a couple more little spin-off games like this. Maybe a Let's Go Johto, for example. While I would prefer the Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire treatment for remakes, a fun, casual Let's Go type of game once in a while isn't so bad. Then we entered the 8th generation of Pokemon with Sword and Shield. Well, first we need to look back on what had the internet in an absolute state of sheer uproar: the Dexit controversy. Effectively, in every mainline Pokemon game up to this point, you could obtain every single Pokemon. The slogan, after all, is "gotta catch 'em all." In some cases, you might have needed to trade them over from previous titles, but point being, it was possible. Leading up to the release of Sword and Shield, however, the fanbase were told that the Dex was being sliced in half. And it did not go down well. Now, here's the reality of the situation. With the total number of Pokemon growing each generation by sometimes hundreds, at some point it becomes extremely resource heavy for the team to fit them all into one game. You then have logistical troubles of how do you spread them across the routes without it becoming a mess, amongst other issues. While it did suck for some people seeing their favourites not make a return, well, not an immediate return should I say, if we look at it reasonably, I do believe the Dexit situation was a fair decision for them to make and ultimately did help the health of the game. But this wasn't the only issues fans had of Sword and Shield. I'll spare going into every detail, but the amount of damage this one tree did to the internet was hilarious. Sticking more closely to the series' traditional route, Sword and Shield were pretty standard run-of-the-mill games. Personally, I don't think they did anything particularly well, but they also didn't do anything worryingly poor. Sword and Shield definitely did feel like a testing ground for what future games would innovate on, which we'll of course discuss a bit later on. The world area though was pretty much a main example of this. Here is the largest expanse of free roamable area we've ever had in a Pokemon game. Pokemon spawn in the overworld, weather systems actively change spawns, and raid battles can be found everywhere. The reality was this area was pretty dull beyond your first few hours experiencing it. With that being said, it's always a pleasure to see a new innovation. Speaking of innovation, well, I don't know if it quite follows that definition, paid DLC. So remember those other 400 Pokemon our game was missing? Alright, well here's 200 of them now and you can have the other 200 later. Just make sure to slide us a bit of money first. Now look, I'm a pretty open-minded guy when it comes to this sort of thing, and I don't mind paying for additional content. When such additional content is straight up, here's another wild area with a 2-hour story, it's a little bit tough to get behind it. In fairness, the Crown Tundra DLC was a much better experience and had more to do, mainly on the subject of Dynamax Adventures, which was a fun way to shiny hunt and catch the legendaries. And honestly speaking, I don't regret buying either one of these. Furthermore, had the core game of Sword and Shield been something much more polished and fleshed out, I have doubts they would have seen as much kickback as they did. But yeah, this is another theme that will make its way back around later on. Even though I very rarely go back to play Sword and Shield, I will admit they do have a special place in my heart. It was my first experience playing a main series title on launch since Black and White. And with the pandemic rolling around a little before the Isle of Armor DLC launched, I put a lot of time into these. There wasn't a whole lot else to do. But now we have what I see as the most interesting period of time in the whole Switch Pokemon era. Gen 4 remakes are finally on the cards. We've waited over a decade for this moment and... oh, but hello. BDSP came out first of the two, and right from the get-go it wasn't what many of us were hoping for. I discussed this a bit earlier on, but I think I would have much preferred the Let's Go Sinnoh over what we ended up with. I do accept that's completely subjective though, so okay, let's move on. Now the thing about BDSP was they were faithful remakes to almost every single detail. Mechanics that didn't work in the original games didn't work in these. The same bugs existed, Shiny Charm still doesn't really work as intended, so on and so forth. We didn't get the Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire treatment we'd been hoping for, and the only noteworthy addition would be the overhauled underground system, but even then it was missing much of the loved base-centered features back from the DS games. This video you're watching right now is one of the first Pokemon videos I've ever made. However, one of the exceptions was that I did revisit these remakes on the channel a few months ago. So I recommend you to go watch that once you've finished this video if you want to hear a bit more. Oh, and if you haven't already, I'd greatly appreciate you hit subscribe. I 100% want to cover Legends EA when that comes out later this year. But then, we get on to not only my favourite Switch game, but one of my favourite top 3 Pokemon games of all time. For a lack of better wording, this simply felt like what Pokemon is supposed to be, according to my definition of course. We get the overworld spawning mechanic as experimented with in Let's Go and Sword and Shield, but this time, the Pokemon are truly one with the environment. They interact with the world around them, they each have very different personalities which affect how you need to approach catching them, and of course we have the factor of them being able to attack you, the player, which adds a lot of spice as we wander around this untamed world. Travelling around becomes an incredibly fluid process thanks to the seamless ride Pokemon mechanics. While you're going through your initial playthrough, this feature makes areas feel as if they're constantly growing in size. Walking around the Obsidian Fieldlands on foot is naturally a slower process and creates the feeling of it being a very large expanse of area. Obtaining your weird ear cuts this out and allows the player to cover more ground in a short space of time. You later unlock a mount to cross rivers previously locking you out of half the map, giving you a brand new section to complete. Carry on through the game, and now with climbing and flying, you can access even more previously inaccessible areas. Despite Legends Arceus only having 5 maps for the player to engage in, they each offer enough to compete with the full world of Sword and Shield, for example. If we remove my biases for a second, when we really look beyond the surface, many of the criticisms I named towards the Let's Go, Pikachu and Eevee do apply here as well. Once you've beaten the main story and complete your Pokedex, there isn't a whole lot left to do beyond shiny hunting. Battling is in the game, albeit not prominent at all in the post-game, including a lack of competitive online play. There's no endgame systems or activities. Straight up, you can either try the long arduous process of perfecting your decks, which doesn't really offer you any reward, or you can shiny hunt, but that's where this noise comes in. When a shiny Pokemon appears in PLA, that audible cue sounds, even if the Pokemon is out of view. It could be in the sky above you, over the other side of a hill, in the water, you simply don't know. But you know it's there somewhere. There's something magical with this moment. You can be travelling across the map, and when you hear that sound, it's like time freezes. You stop what you're doing, lock in, and try and find this shiny you know is already here. If you don't save in this game, it can be quite easy to fail a shiny as well. Let's say Starly's the shiny. If you're running around trying to find it, but the Starly sees you first, it's going to start running away due to its skittish personality. In other cases, you might hear the noise only to later discover it was an alpha, the rarest type of shiny you can get. I don't really know how to explain it. In normal games, it's no shiny then shiny. In Legends Arceus, the whole map is determined right from the moment you load in. If a shiny has spawned, it's already on the map somewhere for you to find, which at least for me gives a feeling of genuinely hunting for the shiny opposed to this binary you get it or you don't. And the sound adds to this almost spin off a wheel. Okay, I know I've got a shiny, but what's it going to be? You can build your own anticipation leading up to the moment, which I think is what adds to the feeling. Of course, shiny odds in this game are very high, and admittedly at this point I've almost found every single shiny possible to obtain. Yet, I keep coming back. PLA makes my brain feel good. The atmosphere, the little hit mark sound effects when your Pokeball hits, seamless travel, you get the point. Legends ZA is right around the corner and it's taking a very different approach which I'm unsure of. Honestly speaking, if the current formula 1-to-1 was reused for another 2 Legends games, I would have been happy. With that being said, I can't complain at the Pokemon Company trying to innovate and actually improve games, and I'm excited to see how the Legends series continues to develop. After all, it will be the first Pokemon game of the Switch 2 era. Keep an eye on the channel for more content on that. Last but not least, we had the introduction of Gen 9 with Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. I don't know how to speak on this game without sounding overly negative. I mean, look, the game does a lot of interesting things and in some areas it does it well. After all, while Legends came close, this is the very first true open world Pokemon game we've ever had. However, the reality of the situation is that the positives don't particularly matter a whole lot. The performance is as bad as we experienced. What's the point in creating a giant open world if we can't explore it without dipping below 15 FPS? Why create a giant open world if, for the most part, it's empty and devoid of character? The overworld spawning made a return, but it feels like we're back in the wild area of Sword and Shield. The Pokemon lose all their character they had in Arceus, and the game can't even keep up with the speed at which the player travels, so the Pokemon just pop in and out of the world slower than you can see them. The raid feature of Sword and Shield returns in a better manner with real-time action opposed to waiting for all 4 turns to cycle, but then again it's the same thing we already did. A new battle mechanic is introduced in the form of terrestrialization, which if I'm not mistaken I think a lot of people in competitive play don't like it too much. I'm not going to act like I know what I'm talking about there, so let me know in the comments. And again, at the end of the day, this is a Pokemon game. As a Pokemon fan, I had fun with this game. I've got hundreds of hours in this, with shiny hunting being the primary driving factor, throw in the DLC cycle, and again, while nothing particularly innovating was added, the new areas were fun enough. But you also need to understand that's always going to be the case for me with every release. I can enjoy the game full well understanding it's bad. While the frame rate and textures were frankly speaking unacceptable, I do still find a way to accept it. For the sake of what the game really is, for me, dipping below the FPS line is something I just got used to, and underneath the rocky surface there is remnants of a fun game. Scarlet and Violet have had more than enough criticism sent their way, and I'd only be regurgitating the same arguments that's been made 1,000 times already. So I'm not going to waste your time by going into too much more detail. Instead, I want to end with this. The Switch era of Pokemon games were fun. It's been a grey area for the series timeline without doubt, but all in all there's a lot the Pokemon Company can learn from it if they choose to do so. The Switch 2 is a new opportunity for the franchise to adapt and overcome challenges it faced over the last few years, and for me, well, I'm optimistic they can do it. Thanks for watching.